A word to the wise. We are an explicit podcast tackling content with adult themes as well as entering spoiler territory if you aren't caught up with us. This week, that would be through chapter 36 of Brandon Sanderson's The Hero of Ages. Hey there, this is Cross.
And I'm PJ.
And we are Words and Whiskey, a podcast for veteran and novice readers alike. We tackle fiction novels and love to talk about what we're drinking. You should think of us as your intoxicating weekly book club.
Crossland is no longer here. We meant to do this episode as an in-person test because we've been remote the entire time that we've had this show going. And Cross is finally in town. Like, sweet, we'll get some episodes done. And then we proceed to drink and have fun and see friends and not record anything. So now he's back in his hometown for a day before leaving again. And I miss you already.
It's true. This is being recorded on Tuesday, like right before this episode is coming out. So this is one of the shortest turnarounds we've had in a while on an episode.
Yeah.
And to that point, I am gone very soon. So yeah, I'm sad that we didn't get to do what we wanted to, but we did still record something in person. We just didn't get to do everything that we wanted to. We didn't get to get through all of it. So
right.
Womp womp. Sometimes that happens. With that, today is our 5th episode discussing The Hero of Ages by Brandon Sanderson, and we are going to chat about chapters 30 through 36. But before we do that, PJ, what are you having today?
I am drinking a key lime pie martini, and I found a recipe for this a while back, and then I was looking for it and couldn't find it, but I found a bunch of different ones, and they were all slightly different, and I don't know, this is kind of an amalgamation of all of them, but it's not, none of them were as good as the one that none of them sounded as good as the one that I found. So I tried to recreate that to the best of my ability. I don't think I got that close, but I think you'll see what I'm talking about. I think it's some part of it is just ingredient based problems, but it is 2 ounces of liquor 43, 1 ounce of vodka, 3/4 of an ounce of key lime simple syrup, 3/4 of an ounce of half and half, all shaken and served in a graham cracker rimmed glass. So I think this has legs. I think this really, really works. But I think my biggest problem is that the key lime simple that I made is not key limey enough. Basically, I was trying to make candied key lime wedges or wheels. And first of all, that didn't work. I don't know if I didn't slice them thin enough or if I didn't give it enough time or what, but it just didn't work. And second of all, it's just not limey enough. You can smell it, and it's a really intense smell when you smell the simple syrup, and you can taste it when you taste it alone. But in the cocktail, it just kind of gets lost. So what I would do instead, I think, it's also a little bit too sweet. It's very much I'm going to a martini lounge, and these are all listed as martinis, but are they really kind of drink? A little bit too sweet. So I'd cut back on the key lime simple. I think I'd even go maybe as low as 1/4 ounce, or I'd straight up go like Demerara simple syrup for 1/4 ounce, and then like half an ounce of key lime juice instead. Really bump up that lime flavor and add a little bit of depth of like character to match the graham cracker and the liquor 43 coming through. So that's where I'm at with that one. Back half beer, Underwater Panther from the Fermentorium. It is a triple IPA with honey. This one is one that you and I each had one of these while you were here. Really nice, smooth. It's not quite a hazy IPA, I don't think I'd say. It's more of a West Coast IPA, a little bit less bitter than I would expect from something of that style, but maybe that's to do with the honey. One of our friends referred to it as stout-like in character. I think that's also to do with the honey, but I don't know if I agree with them on that.
Yeah, I don't know about stout-like. I think that, I mean, I guess I get that sweetness and I can understand that coming through. For me, the fruit felt really pronounced, actually, with the honey flavor. So I thought that the honey and the fruit was really pronounced. This is one of the things that I wanted to really do with that in-person episode, is talk about this. Conveniently, you're drinking a beer that we both had, so at the very least, I feel like we can. But I did get quite a bit of honey, I remember.
Yeah, the honey definitely comes through.
Yeah, because we had the two beers. We had that and then the Super Freak. And I did prefer the Super Freak, but I liked the Underwater Panther. Right?
Yeah. Super Freak is a hazy IPA from Drecker out of Fargo.
Yes.
So I just really like the label on this one. It's just a whole bunch of waves with some tentacles subtly in the background.
Yeah. The secret little Cthulhu monster there. Underwater Panther, gonna get you.
Mm-hmm.
Cool.
Yep. Cool. What about you? What are you drinking?
I don't know what to call it, right? Like, I didn't realize, of course, I'm only here for 24 hours. So I didn't realize that I was out of rye because I didn't remember what I had in stock 10 days prior. And I didn't have any citrus because I didn't go to the grocery store. I had actually pre-bought some frozen meals because I knew that I was going to need something at home. So I bought them ahead of time for this day because I knew that I wasn't going to have time to cook stuff for meals. So I was like, okay, do that. So similarly, cocktail planning was out the window. Thankfully, my dad gave me a couple of beers. So I'm having another Devil's Son IPA that he gave me yesterday when I brought dinner over to their house that I had brought. But the cocktail that I'm having is what I'm terming the Bushwick Special. I say that because there's a Brooklyn cocktail, there's a Bronx cocktail, there's, a number of cocktails that are named after the different boroughs of Manhattan. And I figured, like, why not bring it down to a neighborhood? And this is basically a spin on the Perfect Manhattan, of which I've had on the show a couple of times. What I did is, instead of rye, 2 ounces of bourbon, half an ounce of sweet vermouth, half an ounce of dry vermouth, and 4 dashes of grapefruit bitters. So with all that said, with Bitterman's hopped grapefruit bitters, because I love it. All that said, I haven't tried it yet, but oh man, I so prefer the grapefruit bitters. I would say if I had a little bit more time to prepare, I'd probably grab a grapefruit garnish, an expression of oils as well, just to get a little bit more of that on top. But it is, it is a reworked Manhattan. And so instead of calling it, I don't know, I probably could have called it some suburban Manhattan, but I don't have a special attachment, I guess, to any suburbs. So I just picked where I lived when I lived in New York. So for now, it'll be called the Bushwick Special until I figure out something else. But, basically just spit on Manhattan, swapping out the whiskey and swapping out the bitters.
Nice. Sounds delicious.
Yeah.
Yeah. I just took another sip of this martini, if you can call it that. And the lime's coming through more. I don't know if that's just my taste buds being more used to it. But yeah, maybe there's less tweaking that I have to do. But I don't know. I'll come back to it at some point, I'm sure.
Hey, I mean, fair enough. Whatever works.
Mm-hmm.
Definitely bring it up if it significantly changes or like morphs into like a banana cream pie. You have to bring it up if it changes into a banana cream pie martini.
That's fair.
I will be upset.
So would I. That sounds terrible.
Yeah, that's not really bad. Just like little chunks of banana in the cocktail. So with that, before we talk about these chapters, PJ, how did you feel about this week's reading? Any like overall thoughts?
This week's reading felt a lot more like setup. Like it's like, I don't know, like he's got to set up more dominoes. Like we've been kind of going through the racetrack a little bit and like, oh no, pit stop, set up some more like exposition, and then we'll get going again. That's kind of the vibe that I got off of this section. Not in a bad way. Like it's just a whole lot more additional information that I'm sure will get paid off later.
Yeah, in a very similar way. I feel like it's a stretching of the rubber band, right? So we had the rubber band stretched to a certain level of tension, and now we're just stretching it a lot further so that it just goes harder. You know what I mean? Like most of these things were here, but this is to make sure that they're fleshed out enough. And so it is like lining up extra dominoes, right? To like make sure that they can all fall satisfactorily. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that, but it does feel like this week is predominantly set off with some long-term payoff that we'll talk about. There are some things that pay off some long-term moments that we've been kind of waiting for a long time. So that was kind of my net feelings on this whole week. Is there's a lot of like long-term payoff from the first book. This is the end of a trilogy, and so it's important to think about the whole thing in spectrum of how do we bring all of this to a close. We have to tie all those knots up together. But yeah, that's kind of what I feel. Is this feels like it's a culmination of a couple of different plot threads, which then maybe makes you scratch your head a little bit and wonder, something bad, something good, what's going to happen? I don't know. I will also say we get a lot of hemalurgy this week. Like we get hemalurgy in the logbooks. So I know that we kind of ended last week with this, but I do want to at the very least make mention of it because we do get a comparison of information here. I know that we almost never start with the logbook because we end last week with it, but I do want to reread last week's logbook. So originally, men assumed that Rashek's persecution of the Terrace religion came from hatred. Yet we know that Rashek was himself a Terraceman. His destruction of that religion seems odd. I suspect it had something to do with the prophecies about the Hero of Ages. Rashek knew that Preservation's power would eventually return to the Well of Ascension. If the Terrace religion had been allowed to survive, then perhaps someday a person would find their way to the Well and take up the power. Then use it to defeat Rashek and overthrow his empire. So he obscured the knowledge of the hero and what he was supposed to do, hoping to keep the secret of the well to himself.
And is this addressed in the second logbook of like the proposal of why he would do that? The idea that the reason he would want to make sure he could take Preservation's power would be to put Ruin back in his place or defeat Ruin or whatever. Yeah.
Yeah. Right. And he knows, I think this also implies that he knew that he wasn't the hero himself and that maybe there wasn't a hero to begin with. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. Because, who's picking up the actual, like, is there even a hero? Anyone can pick this up. So he obscures it and gets rid of that religion.
Yeah.
Which is his own religion.
So this also makes it very clear that Ruin's power is different in some way or is separate in some way from Preservation's power. I think that had been a prospect before, but I don't know if it was explicit until this logbook entry, which
I don't think it was. Yeah. I don't know. I think explicitly it wasn't.
Right. So this, just reapproaching it and thinking about it some more, makes me wonder, and this is going tangential, I know, but what would have happened if Vin had taken up the power for herself instead of letting it go? Would anything positive have happened, or would it have been either a straight up trick or come with a twist, like a malicious genie? Like what is the difference between the two powers, or are they identical and it's just who's presenting them?
That's a great question. Yeah, that's definitely a read and find out. And we do get a little bit more on Preservation and Ruin this week in the logbooks. So we'll definitely have more to say, I think, on that front as a whole.
Mm-hmm.
So
that's fair.
That's the other reason that I wanted to reread this, is because I think it kind of provides some context to what we're going to kind of talk about for the rest of the week. To some degree, it's either hemalurgy and sort of the three magic systems that we have on this planet, or it's Ruin and Preservation. So it feels like it all kind of ties together into one thread. So we start off the week here with Elend kind of reading the room similar to the way that he did in the Well of Ascension to start this off. This feels like a chapter that almost feels like it's plucked out of the middle section of the Well of Ascension, in which you get kind of the full conversation between everyone. Part of that is like talking about the formal line of succession. Part of that is talking about who's going to lead the army. And, as a big part of that whole conversation, we discuss Sazed, of whom is really the successor of both him and Vin die. At this point, can you imagine Sazed becoming the emperor?
At this point, absolutely. We've already had one sad boy Lord Ruler. We can have sad boy Sazed as emperor.
We've seen what one Terraceman could do. Yeah, let's see.
Yes. And later on, it becomes more clear that I think that could be good, but I think we'll get into that then. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I mean, specifically, if we want to kind of tease it a little bit, it's when he's talking to Spook and says he's talking to Spook.
The other thing that I get from this, did you get any of that sort of the similar crew tightness in this section?
A little bit. It's a little bit different with Set there.
Yeah, the dynamics off are different for sure.
Yeah, the dynamics definitely different, but it is at the very least the inner chamber conversation again. It's the round table conversation that we've been missing for a while because it's been extenuating circumstances for the most part since the deposition of Ellen.
Yeah, definitely. So obviously, as we've been talking about last week and whatnot, we're prepping for a ball, and Vin comes in and shocks the crew looking gorgeous and complaining about the difficulty of dressing up. I love the way that this whole kind of scene goes. It's a very fun moment, but it's especially funny where like Ham has trapped Set with like these philosophical puzzles, and Ham also kind of playing the part of like the reluctant father seeing a couple off before like prom. You know, I think Ham in this moment is just so funny, and I think Ellen even makes this comment somewhere about like how he's noticing Ham being more himself because he has someone to like pitch his philosophical stuff to that doesn't like it or pushes back. Because he's been missing that in Breeze and says it. So it's a fun thing to see in a bunch of different ways. And I'm glad that Ham has kind of become this, you know, it's sad because Ham has become like a joke kind of in a way, because he's such an interesting philosophical lens, or he was in the first couple of books. And now it's kind of like, it's funny to be trapped with that guy because he's, you know, at the same time, you've got the uncle who won't stop talking about whatever XYZ thing.
Yeah, for sure.
It's so good.
I'm with you. The other funny part about this was Vin's conversation and Vin deflecting the questions about where the dress came from and like claiming it's beneath her as a Mistborn to talk about such things. Like it was, obviously a little tongue in cheek and a little bit funny, a little bit goofy, but kind of pretending to fit into that high society stereotype of stuffy dress wearing, ball going person.
Right. I think that's so fun. And obviously there's a bunch of parts in this section that we'll get to talk about a little bit later when we actually get to the ball. But this feels like a more complete Vin in a lot of ways. And that's why it's kind of nice to see this kind of balancing of humor and juxtaposition of like, oh, well, this is a little floofy. It feels like she's playing again. You know, in the first book, it felt like she was kind of cornered, but then she gets to this point where she's playing and kind of experiencing and having a good time with life. But
she doesn't realize that until it's gone, that she was enjoying it.
Yeah. And I know that I spent a lot of time picking at this wound in the last book, but it kind of becomes text here. So we'll talk about that more. But you know, that was kind of why I was bringing it up, because it's like, well, it is kind of, but it's like, it's just not to the degree that, you know, it's there. It's just not to the degree that she's, you know, wants or thinks that she should be at. Anyway, we'll talk about that in a bit. But now the pair of Ellen and Vin finally make their way off into that other ball that we're talking about. And it really feels like a return to form where they were in the first book. You know, it's a payoff of a promise that didn't feel like we would get it, you know, and it feels so good because the most important thing I think from this entire chapter is that Vin admits that she's grown into someone that she likes. I think that is just such it's such an incredible moment compared to where she's at in the first book. We've seen her grow, we've seen her change. And I think we talked about at the beginning of this book doesn't feel like Vin's book. The first two books very much so feel like Vin's book. This one less so. And I think this is a part of the reason why, because she has become the person that she needs to be. And so it's hard to focus on her character work when she's already done.
Yeah. I think beyond. So I'm conflicted about this scene because while I really like what you just mentioned about Vin, and I also really love how bold their entrance is, like shooting down and just like superhero landing as Mistborn into the red carpet, essentially, is what they do. But it's surrounded by, or it's interwoven with this sort of cartoonish unresolved aggression from Ellen to the guards that just goes completely unresolved, like completely unaddressed after this scene. Like, he straight up pushes a guard with pewter across the room, and then they just walk on before they can call someone, and then it just never gets addressed again, which I felt like with somebody that high profile and doing something intentionally that high visibility in order to get into this event, you would think there would be at least some callback to it and some maybe mention of it from someone later. But it's just
like
lost.
The gaggle of women, would have been a great opportunity to like bring that up to some degree. But I think there's an element of fear there. I do agree with you. It does feel weird to me. It would have been better to like Jedi mind trick in, like do some soothing or rioting or what have you to like make their way in.
Mm-hmm. Something.
Which I think,
something other than like it just felt like a cartoon. I don't know how else to describe it. It just took me out of the moment.
Sure. Yeah, like I said, I don't fully disagree. I think that it could have been addressed in other things, other moments. But I mean, at the same time, like that's an intimidation tactic more than anything else too, which is also what they're kind of doing to get in here. It's just that you would expect some follow up on who's intimidated by it, Mm-hmm. Like it's very clear that's the intent of the move.
Yeah.
The question is why didn't we see people be intimidated by it?
Or
and
why
that doesn't mean yeoman necessarily. It just means
it could have been yeoman.
Else.
It could have been yeoman talking about the hypocrisy
Yeoman's
of coming in here. No, but as fuel for his argument against Elend, for like how he came into the party, how he strong-armed himself into the party.
Doesn't he mention that he like showed up to the party without an invitation though? Like,
yeah, but he didn't. He didn't say he assaulted a guard to get in.
I'm sure because it's a ska guard and he doesn't really care.
That's,
but,
maybe fair.
Because he is maintaining that same sort of demure attitude about the whole leadership thing. And
Mm-hmm.
To your point, though, I think I agree with you entirely. I would have rather seen like a Jedi mind trick, but at the same time, like a big flourish, sure. Something showy. It does feel off that it wouldn't be mentioned. It feels like in an adaptation, like we're saying, you would see him push and this guy like skid on his butt across the floor. And it could be like kind of a funny comedic moment, but then you see the fallout of that moment be the people around reacting and kind of like whispering and going quiet. The whole dance floor goes quiet or whatever. The music stops and then they like walk in and
hand the card to the announcer.
Right.
Yeah.
I think that's how you would adapt that scene to make sense. So I agree with you. I can see all the details, but it's like I'm just missing the through line to make the whole thing work perfectly. So I also really love the way that Vin approaches these women after they kind of break off and separate into their groups, because like they say, the cliques are pretty much separated by genders at this point. They say that there are some couples dancing and in pairs dancing, but they've pretty much separated into these gaggles of people. And after reflecting on what she was like when she was playing the part of Valette Renew, it's just so cool to see her be back in this moment where she was so shy. And instead now she just kind of makes a big point about the fact that like she killed Shauna L'Ariel, who is a cousin to Lady Patricin. And it's just such a good moment all around. But what'd you make of kind of the intimidation tactics and what's going on?
I think she's, first of all, very comfortable in the position that she's in now. I think it's for no small part due to the fact that she spent so much time as Valette, just sitting back and watching and taking everything in and really just kind of studying and understanding exactly how these women interacted and reacted to different types of people and different personalities and different conversations. So this feels very, very much channeling both Shauna L'Ariel and just the boldness that comes with being an empress and the heir to the survivor and just all the high profile positions that she's been thrust into. This feels like a rounding out of that and her becoming comfortable finally in her sort of place of authority.
And that's great. Like you said, like this is a payoff. And we had the promise of like these things happening beforehand. And then the situation of the Well of Ascension demands that we kind of ignore that promise because there's so much kind of going on around it that it's like balls aren't necessary. This government's failing. We have to do other things. We've got to find the well. I'm really sick in the head. I'm this knife and I need to do that. And it gets to a point that we'll talk about a little bit later. And she brings it up as such because it's like, I could have been doing this. This should have been me. Instead, I let other things rule me. And that's why I think it's such a great moment, is because, like you said, it's a giant payoff on a promise.
Yeah, totally.
And like
totally agree.
I think that's the big thing is I like seeing characters go from novice to masters in a lot of things. And this is a perfect example of that. And it feels very well handled.
It does.
So with that, we go into chapter 31. We've got a very short logbook here. Rashik wore both black and white. I think he wanted to show that he was a duality, preservation and ruin. This, of course, was a lie. After all, he'd only touched one of the powers, and only in a very small way at that.
That's also interesting. So this was what I was kind of alluding to before, to a certain extent. The fact that like these are very, very different sources. Whether or not they're different powers, I don't know. But we know what Rashik did with the power. We know what he did with preservation's power. What he's able to do. He very significantly and in a very real way affected not only the world, but the flora and fauna within it. And that's in a small way. What the fuck, dude? What's in a big way? I mean, collapsing galaxies? Like, what are the cosmic implications of this power? And how far reaching can this go?
It sounds like something that would be really fun to explore in like a multi-book, a multi kind of universe planetary series.
Nobody would do anything like that.
Cosmere because it's cosmic. It's kind of fun. Nah. Who would do that? Who would do that? Who would read that?
Different magic sources and styles and planets and worlds.
Right. Now, given I don't want to spend a whole lot of time talking about Elantris because we still haven't even done that for the episode that we want to do yet. But it raises interesting questions having read two things now, right?
Mm-hmm. It does.
So, yeah. We'll talk about that probably more in the Elantris episode and eventually in like a wrap up. So when we get there, I don't think you've read the prologue of that book either yet because
I don't believe I have.
No. Anyway, we'll have to have you do that before we get to it. So cool. With that, let's go into the chapter itself. We've got some stuff to talk about with Sazed and Spook here. And we find them in the Lord Ruler's Cavern and our group of Alrian, Breeze, and everyone kind of adjusting to living and moving all the troops into this area, this cavern that we'd found with all these supplies, arranging tables, kind of getting everyone in real gradually without trying to signal any serious movements, even though they have, I think 200 troops is what is the previous number.
I believe so.
Sounds right. Yeah, and they chat about what should be done about Quellion, and Spook suggests outright assassinating him. But Sazed suggests against that and instead wishes to move to undermine him. What'd you make of the kind of the decision here and the thought process?
So this specifically is what I was talking about earlier when you mentioned what I thought about Sazed being emperor and being in line.
Sure.
This kind of decision-making and level-headedness is what we could expect from him in that position. Mm-hmm. And like, I don't know, it's a sophisticated plan and forward thinking plan. And it's intelligent. It's smart. It's not reactionary or emotional. And that's exactly what you want out of a leader of an entire like populace. So
cool.
Yeah.
And I agree with you. I think that that's a very smart move. And it's important to remember too and consider that. And I want to bring this up because I think it's a theme that circles back a couple of times inside of this week even, is that Spook is a 17, 18-year-old boy still. You know, he's a young dude, and he, in that same naivete, doesn't consider some of these things and doesn't even consider the implications of some of his actions, as we find later. So, you know, it is a very interesting spot that we find ourselves in with Spook. But I agree with you on the side of Sazed, where he does have enough faculty for sure and enough consideration that he could be a leader. He definitely has all of those capabilities and qualities. However, he is not in the place to be a leader.
Yeah.
He's very much on a very different side of that fence at the moment.
So, speaking of spook, I'm going to probably mention it a few times throughout this episode, but I think it's important to remember that he is constantly in conversation with this Kelsier being that he's talking to. And I don't think it's a stretch to think that this is the same entity that was Zane's god. We know for a fact that he is interacting with it much more than what we see, because we only get a couple little bits of conversation between him and Kelsier, but it's mentioned that he's like basically constantly talking to him, and he's getting used to having him in his head. And like, it seems like we're only exposed to a little bit of it. So that sort of suggestion of assassination, could that have been born from pressure from this god character, which we know, talking to Zane, was constantly saying like, kill him, to basically everybody? Like, maybe that's an influence that we have to consider when we're talking about Spook's decision making. What gets complicated is trying to keep that hidden from us while still being in Spook's point of view.
I think the important thing to even clarify here just a little bit is the fact that we are mostly sitting at this point in Sazed's point of view from almost all this chapter, right? So there's a good chance, to your point, is that he might be talking to Kelsier right now. Even at the end of last week, when he starts to mention like some hope, and he has a weird vibe about him when talking with, since he started talking with Kelsier, especially from Sazed's perspective, and Breeze's even, they're starting to have those suspicions build up. And while I don't think that that's something that they actively are pursuing at the moment, I think we as readers are left to actively pursue that thought in this moment, especially when we get into I think it's chapter 34, 35 after the part break, because that's when it really kind of becomes we go from Sazed to Spook, and within the same chapter, perspective wise. So before I continue down this path of like making that my main assumption, I don't want you to like give anything away as far as, oh no,
obviously you won't. You're good at that. You've had a lot of experience in me like trying to trick you into giving me more information. Is there anything that I'm glaringly missing that would point against that being a valid theory?
I don't think so.
Okay, cool.
Not that I can think of immediately. I mean, the only thing is like, what are the similarities between the two? You know, like, how do you draw the lines between Spook and Zane? So that would be kind of the meta question. Why doesn't everyone hear a ghost in their head? So
fair.
Last week, we had talked about the citizens, Quellian's use of Kelsier and religion of the survivor as a tool by which to encourage and motivate the citizenry through self-rule, and kind of like utilizing that as this tool to rule them. And Breeze seems to suggest that he wouldn't have taken it that far, that Kelsier himself would not have taken it that far as to kill the nobility and to have kind of broken a lot of these lines. And Spook feels pretty similarly about how it's all been twisted. Again, this is kind of a note that Sanderson's clearly pointing us to, with intent of religion versus actuality and practice and kind of coming through. I think that this is maybe the biggest flag in the ground for this issue so far inside this novel, to me.
It is. And what gets even more complicated about it and interesting about it is that Sazed, our religious scholar, is once again finding himself in this position where he agrees with Quellian regarding Kelsier, or at least can't find a contradiction in the words being used, despite the misinterpretation of the spirit of the message, supposedly. Like, everyone's pointing to it as a misinterpretation, but I'm still not entirely convinced that Kelsier would disagree either, because it talks about, I can't remember if it was a logbook or if it was just Sazed's kind of inner monologue, talking about how Kelsier talked about a deep-rooted hatred of the nobleman, and that doesn't get addressed very much, especially in those terms.
Yeah, I think that this gets back to something that we've talked in previous books. I don't remember if it's in this novel as explicitly as you're saying, but I do think that it's talked about. And that's where I think I also pose the question of like, would Sazed have let Breeze be a part of the group if he knew that he was a full-blooded nobleman, if he knew that that was his lineage?
Given this text and what we're seeing with this, I would say no.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's seeming less and less so. Right.
It certainly is. It's seeming a lot less and less so. But at the same time, that could be why, we'll get to it later, but why Kelsier, quote unquote Kelsier, talking to Spook, talks about how he never really liked Breeze.
Mm-hmm.
So who knows?
Right. There's some intent there, and there's some questions as well. So I agree with you. I think that it's something that is very difficult to nail down at the moment. And I think the book is kind of playing with your expectations, but we do have an understanding of Kelsier, of course. I mean, we only have that one book really to get to know and understand Kelsier on a base level. And as such, we know way more about Kelsier than the people who worship him as a religious figure do. You know what I mean?
True.
We have way more of an inside track there as the readers. Dramatic irony is heavy. And I don't know, he obviously wouldn't be as intense of a ruler as Quellion, but there is a question of how far would he go, I think still that exists.
There is. But
yeah,
it's feeling less wholesome the more and more that we're getting into it. And maybe that's an intentional kind of twist of the expectation through just these conversations and like pointing out the very specific details of what Kelsier has said in the past to twist the perspective.
I think to add to that just a little bit too, it's important to note that Kelsier really did kind of change his tune a little bit very near the end. It felt like he was kind of underdeveloped in his thought process because of the way that he eventually comes to treat Elend in those final moments. You know, like he comes to decide to spare him and to actually fight to save him because he knows that Vin loves him. And so there are a couple of things that indicate that he probably would have changed. He may have just not met the right people to have encouraged that change.
He did that through gritted teeth. As a gesture for Vin.
I don't know if it was a gesture so much as an understanding of what it would do to Vin to have him killed. You know what I mean? He goes out of his way to make sure that he is not hurt.
Yeah.
He does kind of come to terms with that in those moments through gritted teeth. But I think especially in reflection, and I think especially in a reread, once you understand, it seems as though, I'm not saying that he's coming to terms with, well, maybe there are some good ones and the bad ones. I think that he is at the very least understanding that maybe I should be evaluating people as people. And that's a consideration that he hadn't spared before, because all of the noblemen that he'd met had mostly been pieces of shit, with the exception of Breeze, of whom he didn't know was a nobleman. You know, so it's like there's this weird dichotomy of like treating people like people. He likes Breeze, who is this straight-blooded nobleman, and like thinks that he's a good member and a good friend. There are complexities with Kelsier that didn't get worked out fully before he died, unfortunately, and those have been latched onto as this religion by these groups.
I think where things really break down between Kelsier's like actual ideals and the ideals propped up are one of nuance. Certainly. And that's the fact that anybody, like the idea that anybody with noble blood would be considered a full-blown nobleman and should be treated as such. But we know that Kelsier was a champion of the Ska Mistings, which are necessarily noble blood, which like his issue with the noblemen were the noble people that were standing and oppressing the Ska. Not the fact that they had noble lineage. It was more to do with their position and their disposition above the rest of the populace. Does that track?
Cool. Yep.
That seems like a weird thing for you to not expound upon, but I'm going to trust you.
Well,
and we can continue. That's fine. That's fine. It's A-okay. I trust you. I understand how complicated these books and these stories are, and I'm A-okay with like that can get into muddy territory as far as spoilers go. So let's move forward.
I think there was always another secret. So Sazed in this moment remains a kind of sad version of himself, absolutely lost between all these moments of trying to bring his group together and wrestling with his sad boy self at the same time. He, in quote here, says, "In the past, logic and thought had always been his refuge. However, his emotions didn't respond to logic." It's such a chewy moment here for our boy. What'd you think about this?
So what I'm wrestling with this question is, if it's not emotion, what's it a refuge from? Is it stress? Like, you would think that the refuge that he takes would be a refuge from something emotional. Grounding himself in logic and thought would be, I would think, a respite from out of control emotions. But is stress considered an emotion, or is it something entirely different? And that's what he's grounding himself from.
Because I think it's just a deeper emotion. You know what I mean? Like quantifying, he's never experienced such a deep and profound loss that it's a little bit different.
Okay.
And so I think that, I don't think that you're wrong. I just think that it's a matter of depth in particular. I think what the code is trying to get at is before, when he was stressed or when he faced adversity in different moments inside of these novels, we've seen him turn to the texts. We've seen him turn to refrains of religions to bring hope to other people. We've seen him take to books to try to find solutions to problems through searching through the Well of Ascension, the prophecies of the terrorists, and like all of the other texts that he had access to. So I think that what he's saying is that usually research, and to some degree, I mean, you can say what you will about this response, but to some degree, reality has been like his tool to address problems. And that's just gone out the window with what feels like a deeper issue, because he can no longer rely on, because what's been called into question is his logic and his thoughts entirely.
Okay. I can get behind that.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah. And that's why I think that this is such a powerful moment, is because it's like, this is really kind of the exposing of the nerve in a big way of why. And even when the conversation progresses a little bit further, there's like Spook mentioning Tyndwyl, which I think is huge. And that's like, she acted this way. And for him, that's this moment of, wow, Spook is he's becoming emotionally intelligent and like recognizing this when I didn't. But at the same time, I think that's an acknowledgement of this teenager is pointing to the teenage thing, the emotional thing. And Sazed's emotional state is more responsive to that as an answer, as a response. Mm-hmm. So it's kind of hard to say that it's the right thing. It's just a thing.
Yeah. This is making me realize that the existence of this phantom, for the lack of a better term, for Spook, I don't believe it's Kelsier. Like, sure. I think that's probably clear by the way that I'm like skirting around calling him Kelsier. But it's making me not trust, or not put so much trust in Spook as much as I would have, or as much as I want to in this, because I'm constantly thinking, are these insights actually from Spook, or are they like interjections from this Kelsier figure pushing him towards something to say,
like a manipulation?
Yeah.
And
it's breaking down trust in the character, and I don't really like that.
It's interesting. I don't know if I read the Tyndwyl bits that way, if that makes sense, but I do ask questions in my own head about the conversation about Kelsier being with them in this moment. That's where I feel like he's being pushed. To me, it doesn't feel as though the Kelsier thoughts take the forefront, or rather in the case of Tyndwyl, in the case of these emotional responses, and even in the case of past events, it feels very much like Spook is trying to relate to his friend more than it is when he's mentioning things like Kelsier's looking over them, and like that stuff feels floaty, religious.
I have the exact opposite feeling on that one, because
really,
this feels so articulate and so profound, whereas the other one, it feels like he could have gone a little bit farther to be a little bit more clear about what was actually happening to him. but he's not that articulate of a person, and he doesn't quite know exactly what to say in order to convey the information that he has to Sazed, to get him to understand what he's talking about.
I can agree on that front, on the front of it feels more articulate, but I also feel like it feels more spook. Like talking about Tyndall in that way feels more like an 18-year, a 17-year-old, a 16-year-old in his age range. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. Like it feels like she was the logical one. She loved studying and she loved a lot of the things you did. She enjoyed talking about the biographies and the leaders, and that just like pings in Sazed's brain and sets him off in a track. I don't know that feels like the Kelsier voice. What's the quote that Sazed says to himself here? I'm finding it real quick. However, the fact that Spook had been the one to make such an astute observation gave Sazed pause. It was a very clever way of looking at things. Instead of contradicting him, Spook had offered a possible explanation. So to me, it was like, because he knew, right? Here's the quote itself that it's referencing. Your woman, the other keeper, Tyndall. I heard her talk about religion. She didn't think very much of it. I'd have thought that maybe you wouldn't talk about religion anymore because that might be what she'd have wanted, which makes it feel like he's like they had a conversation and they came out on the other side of their relationship being like, religion doesn't make sense. Here it is, because she was so logical. So I don't feel like that is a manipulation necessarily. It feels like something that Spook could come to the conclusion of on his own.
That's true. But if it's something that very pointedly gets Sazed,
that feels like a manipulation. Yes, I understand exactly where you're coming from. I just have this feeling from the language that it feels more like Spook than the assertions relating to the Kelsier ghost.
That's fair.
Yeah.
No, I'm with you entirely. Mm-hmm. It's always going to be in the back of my mind that there is potentially something pushing him in a direction that isn't necessarily natural. And that's fair, because we've been pushed that way before. That's the entire Well of Ascension, is we were pushed to get Vin to the well, and that was manipulation from Ruin entirely. So right. I guess my point is, can I trust this character growth from this character anymore?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's fair. That makes
especially
sense.
Like now we're finally in his head, and we're finally in Spook's perspective, and like we get more Spook. Awesome. I'm excited. It's great. I don't trust any of it anymore.
Oh man.
Except for when we're like actually in his head,
Mm-hmm.
Which is always fun.
Cool. With that, we end with Sazed beginning to tear apart the next religion in his portfolio and moving closer to, as he says, the truth.
Yeah, we've got a very tenacious sad boy, don't we? His sad work is never done.
It's tough. And truly, in this case, speaking from experience, writing a depressed character is perhaps the most difficult thing. It's the most difficult thing that you could try to write a character as a character trait, truly, because a depressed character, by the very nature of being depressed, is inactive. They don't want to do anything. And so to give Sazed this trait of needing to peel through these religions, at the very least gives him a base motivation to do things. Because often when I go through cycles of depression, I'm not motivated to do shit. Most people aren't. That's the way that depression works. So that makes for a very uninteresting read. It is why the novel that I finished in late 2021, early 2022 won't see the light of day, because it's so fucking hard to make that interesting. So, yep. Sazed's a great example. There's another character in a book that I read recently that's another great example that I won't make mention of. But yeah, it's such a hard thing to do, and I'm glad that Sanderson has done it so well here, because it does portray something very necessary and base for these characters as well.
Yeah, I agree. And I think you took some time railing on it for a little bit, but I think it works well in Sazed's case, the fact that we had that time jump.
Yes.
And we get to see him kind of already gone through the long valley of depression. And at this point, he's kind of at the point where he's starting to maybe have the opportunity to climb out of it.
Yes, he sees opportunity as opposed to when you're just kind of stuck in the valley, to your point.
Right.
Yeah, that's a great comparison. The other comparison I would make is to the lead of Midnight Mass. The story opens on a car crash that the main character that you're following for most of the show is the driver in and kills another person while drunk driving. And then you cut to 3 or 4 years later when he's out of jail for the manslaughter charge that he gets. And you skip the valley, but you still get the throes of like what he feels. And it's a very smart way to handle it because you can still embody the impact of depression without really reeling in on the live in the moment affect.
Right. Totally.
That's why my entire book would have to be rewritten. In addition, at this point, it would be too similar to Midnight Mass. With that, we go to chapter 32. We've got our logbook here. Allomancy, obviously, is of preservation. The rational mind will see this. For in the case of allomancy, net power is gained. It is provided by an external source, preservation's own body.
So this seems very clearly calling back to, I think, a passage from earlier, calling energy the body of a god. I think that's the exact term used, but something very similar to that, if not exactly those words. Does that ring a bell?
It does, and unfortunately, my Kindle is being a piece of shit. Hold, please.
I think it's talking about the black smoke in one of the rooms.
So, it's all the way back in chapter 14. Rune's consciousness was trapped by the Well of Ascension, kept mostly impotent. That night, when we discovered the well for the first time, we found something we didn't understand, a black smoke clogging one of the rooms. Though we discussed it after the fact, we couldn't decide what that was. How could we have possibly known the body of a god, or rather the power of a god, since the two are really the same thing? Rune and preservation inhabited power and energy in the same way a person inhabits flesh and blood.
That's it. That's what I'm thinking of. So
glad
good to see
I read
that
it all off to you. Yeah.
Good to see that kind of circle back a little bit in a more contextual way.
It also begins to provide this context and conversation around where these abilities come from.
It starts to, for sure. And it's no secret we'll get the other ones in the next two. Yeah.
With that, allomancy being a preservation, does that make sense to you? I mean, hemalurgy being of ruin makes sense, given the context.
I don't quite get the obvious nature of it. And I don't quite think that it makes sense given the context that hemalurgy and ruin are interwoven together. It doesn't... I'm failing to grasp the obvious interconnectedness that you seem to be
Okay.
aware of.
Sure. I guess while we can focus on hemalurgy when we get there more, I was thinking about more of the connection between preservation and allomancy. Do you see that one as obvious or not? Like, what do you make of the statement of it being obviously is of preservation?
It doesn't make sense to me at all. I don't...
Okay, it doesn't feel obvious to you.
No.
Okay, cool.
It just feels like there's something that I'm missing. There's a piece that I'm missing that would maybe unlock my ability to see this as like the obvious connection. But I feel like he's explaining the reason why it's obvious, and it's still going over my head.
Yeah, it feels like we're missing like a detail there. So I don't want to, I don't want to go into it too far, but I do at the very least want to draw the Christian comparison to the Eucharist a little bit here, which is the body of a god providing you with something, as like a renewing of something. And this feels very much Eucharistic in its own right.
That thing that dangles in the back of your throat.
No. Yeah, I guess for folks who don't know or weren't raised incredibly Catholic, what the Eucharist is ultimately it's a sanctification of a representation of the body and blood of Christ for Christians of whom believe in that, to sort of be a renewing of faith in the way that Catholics kind of look at it. So it's a way for them to renew their vow to Christ and basically say, hey, by doing this, I'm taking part in the body and blood of Christ, like he did at the Last Supper with his disciples. So effectively, this isn't the same, but it evokes similar tones, and it's hard to ignore that from a proclaimed Christian author.
Right.
The point here being, though, is that it does have this nature. Allomancy is this nature, as suggested, of sacrament to it. Like it, and it's not suggesting that allomancy in and of itself is like a holy art of worshiping preservation. It's just that it has a direct connection between preservation and the magic form. It's much more scientific. So we start off this chapter with Teldin, one of Elend's old drinking buddies from the first book. I think his inclusion is a great way for us to get an eye on what many of the Final Empire's nobility did after its collapse, and where and how they scurried off from the unstable governments of the central dominance. What'd you make of how that conversation around government went?
Well, I think much in the way that Kelsier's message has been religiously misinterpreted and twisted in different ways. The philosophical musings of Elend and his drinking buddies have kind of manifested themselves in very starkly different forms of governmental ideals between this guy and Jostes and Elend. Like, after they're all separated and after they all go their separate ways, I mean, we see it all from Elend's lens from the jump. But he's the only one that seems to really be living out exactly what they were talking about back in their high towers.
I think that's such a great thing to bring up here, because it does really feel like that. It does have that sense and sensibility about it of none of the drinking buddies did it right outside of Elend. And Elend tried the most purely. Jostes tried. And you can assume the other two, including Teldin, didn't do anything, because it was the five of them, right? And so there were 5 drinking buddies. Mm-hmm. And so, we've got 1, 2, 3. Okay, so 4 of them didn't do it right in total. And even Elend failed with his original intent. Still managed to manifest a version of what he wanted, but given the circumstances, he's stuck in a very different loop at the moment. So we can forgive him a little bit, I guess. But
I think it's really a matter of how quickly you come to realize that you have to have concessions to the ideals. Right. And Elend lasted the longest before he's like, all right, something has to give. We've got to do what's best.
I don't want to say that it's pure and holy, but I do want to say that there's an argument that at the very least Jostes did a good job. But the problem is that he was almost too pure, given the description that we got from him in that moment in the tent in the Wall of Ascension. So, yeah. I think
he was broken by the slaughter of his family. That was his turning point.
Yeah.
He abandoned it at that point, as far as the pure.
In a similar way, he sought power to pull off the thing that he wanted to. That Elend has since achieved power, received power, and is now doing. It's fucked up. I hate that comparison, but I think it is totally ignorant to ignore that Jostes and Elend have a similar path. The difference is the power that they found.
And I think an even more apt comparison and similarity between the two is the fact that Elend was so appalled by the idea that Jostes would march an army of Koloss on a city with threat of slaughtering innocents within that city to the Koloss. It's exactly what he's threatening and exactly what he's doing now. But we see it from his lens of, I have to do this for the greater good, so it's okay. That's what Jostes got executed for.
Right. I don't remember if you remember me mentioning this. I thought this happened in Hero of Ages. I didn't think that Jostes died until this book. I thought that his Koloss army was stolen from him then, not at the end of Well. And I think that's what messes me up so much, is that there's just this, it's the intent of the power that he stole, and for the immediate purposes that differentiate the two. He Jostes, King Jostes, is still functioning just like Emperor Elend, but the difference is that Emperor Elend has the faculty over his power and his capabilities because it's him, the Mistborn, that's all powerful, versus Jostes had to prop up the power how he could by manipulating through an economic system, which isn't wholesome. It's not a good thing that he did. He tricked the Colossus potentially into believing that they could be human. But
isn't that almost more impressive, though?
It is more impressive. There's no doubt that it's more impressive.
Differently impressive, I guess.
Yeah. I didn't want to focus on this too much, but it does feel like an interesting thing now that we can talk about and compare, especially with the third lens of Teldin being the guy who basically wussed out of the whole thing and was like, it was fun to talk to you guys. Like, I had a good time. I was your buddy, but like, I'd rather be safe and comfortable than uncomfortable and pushing boundaries.
Right.
Which, say what you will about Jostes, but at the very least, he tried.
Yeah, for sure.
And unfortunately, in this moment, Elend is easy on him compared to Jostes. That's fucked up to me, I think.
Yeah, it is.
But I do appreciate how this turns into a conversation about his marriage to Vin and a much more kind of friendly turn. You know, again, he's being very friendly towards Teldin. This dance, this wouldn't even be the place to do something very intimidating or like stab your friend, you know, through the front. It's nice to see that his intent mostly matches up, despite him obviously following that cowardly path that we were talking about before. But what'd you make of the notes on Vin?
Is this the point where it's called into question whether or not Vin killed the Lord Ruler, or was that with Yeoman?
I think that's here. I think. Pretty sure.
These kind of blend together for me a little bit.
Yeah, it's fair.
Like these conversations.
I mean, the big accusation is that like Elend became the Lord Ruler, right? And so that's another thing to contend with in this conversation, which
I think he's on that path.
He pretty much did. Yeah. Which is why I think later, well, I guess we'll talk about it right now, but you know, we'll talk about it in a second, I guess, but I do want to double check here. It looks like it is with Yeoman. Yeah.
Okay. I guess that makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah. So what did he talk? I don't remember the I don't remember the differences. I don't remember the conversation about Vin that he had here as opposed to with Yeoman.
It's really just, it was mostly about marriage and like not inviting your close friend and couple of different things. So he was like, no, we had a court wedding, which is basically what happened.
He was barely invited to that wedding. Vin didn't tell him. Vin showed up and said, we're married now.
And Sazed was like, yes,
Sazed make
queen.
it so.
Sazed said, yes, queen. And then it happened.
Yeah. Like Elend had a wedding surprised upon him.
I mean, happily so, but
yeah, he accepted.
Yeah.
But like they didn't plan that, or he wasn't involved in the plan.
Right.
Which I feel like is true for a lot of grooms, but at least they know it's happening.
That's a fair enough point. I do want to move into talking about Yeoman. So let's talk about Yeoman for a second. We've got... We meet Yeoman, of course. This is the first time, and he's so bold that he wears a bead of atium on his forehead. What do you think about their conversation about the right to rule, as well as their sort of philosophical sparring that kind of goes back and forth, and the offer to allow Yeoman to continue his own rule? What'd you make of the whole sequence?
This felt like a tease. And I say it that way because it feels like this is being set up to be a very prominent, not quite adversary, but counterpoint it's this really proper, respectable, philosophically and intellectually that Elend gets to like you said, spar against. That's a great way to put it. It's a really fun dynamic, and it feels cut short. And I can only imagine that this is a very well fleshed out character that we're going to see a lot more of going forward between Elend and Yeoman. So my hope is that means that he'll be a king under Elend, much like Set would be. Whether or not that's giving Set the city and giving Yeoman something of a more prominent position, as a result of fulfilling like both promises. We'll see. I don't know. It just, he feels like a very, very fun character in comparison to Elend.
And he does promise something very different. I think it's so fun to have these, and I don't want to paint them so explicitly because we kind of have 4 antagonists. We have so many antagonists in these novels. But if you think about the kind of different ones that we had in the first book, it was pretty much the Lord Ruler for the most part, almost exclusively. In this book, in Well, we move into Straff, a little bit of Set, a little bit of Penrod, and sort of the Well as an ambiguous antagonist that's kind of sitting in the background, lurking in the distance. In this book, we've got Quellion and Yeoman as these kind of dueling, and Ruin as these like trio of antagonists that all kind of have their own thing. And Yeoman is really interesting because he is that philosophical enemy. He's one that cannot be beat. Well, that maybe can be beat with pure force, but that would be a philosophical loss in the way that he would approach treating his population to say, like, this man is not a good man because of the things that he did to get here. He is a truly profound enemy in that way. And I think that's what makes him such a fun foil for Elend in a big way, because I think that what's so crazy is that old Elend, rather Elend from the Well, would have done pretty well against Yeoman in a very different way. But current Elend has gotten so almost reliant on the show of force that he's forced to revert to his old tactics. But that's not necessarily a bad thing.
No, I don't think it's a bad thing at all.
In his other way. Yeah.
I think it makes him stronger.
Totally.
I think it will make him stronger to be able to hone that ability again. And really like have this chess opponent,
Yeah, and I think that's what makes him so interesting, especially when they're like bringing up the philosophers back and forth about like, Gautier or whatever the fuck that guy's name is, Gallingscaw. Sorry, not Gautier would be just as good though. You should consider using that. But Gallingscaw or Durton, and like they bring up book titles and they're throwing them back and forth.
The fact that Elend gives him a better argument against him proves to me that 1, he's enjoying this, and 2, this is good for him. This is what he needs.
Yeah, I definitely agree with you. And I think we get even a more refined point on this in a moment, but I would be remiss if I didn't at the very least talk about moving in Elend's perspective to one of the sweetest moments of the series to date, and that is Elend and Vin's first dance. And there's so much beauty and serenity and poignancy in this moment that this time when I was reading it today on the couch to write these notes, I was on the verge of tears reading it again, because it is such a great moment in which they come to a lot of realizations that we'll talk about in a second. But just talking about the dance itself, it's so good to see this kind of accumulation and this sort of release valve on this pressure that's been going on for so long. I think of the same way, like you can have will they, won't they couples, and like sex is that release valve where it's like, okay, they will. And this is their release valve, even though we know that they've had sex before, because this has been the thing that, Vin's been looking forward to forever.
So much so he busts out the book. And Vin is so caught up and distracted by this moment, and that the fact that it's actually this dance that she's like been waiting for and looking forward to, and had thought was kind of lost to the past, and she overlooks this joke in it. So she comes across as this kind of uptight and just not unreasonable and not naggy, but like verging on that sort of feeling.
She's like picking at him. She's picking directly at wounds,
I don't think for the most part she understands that this is a joke and that this is a callback to all of the time they spent at those dances, because
I think she eventually gets it. I think she does eventually get it.
Eventually, but until then, we don't see that side of Vin very often, of this kind of naggy personality that's like picking at him, like because it doesn't feel like it's joking. Eventually it does. Eventually, like, she realizes it, and it's this relief a little bit.
So on the other side of that, I want to clarify that there's an element that pops up later that I think is important to mention. This is all going on during the dance, but they have this very serious conversation, right, about identities and what they were before and what they are now, and sort of the necessity of these moments. I don't want to skip over your thoughts at all, but I want to say that this is something that comes up here, and it feels like this is Ellen simultaneously admitting to this old side for the first time in a long time, and it comes across in this joke that he's planning, but she takes it seriously because she is thinking in this moment very seriously about who she was and who she should be now and who she is now, and how she's changed, and she's no longer letting that Mistborn side just dominate her. She's merging the two together, really, and she has successfully done so. So I want to make mention of that because I think to your point,
I can't fucking believe you.
What?
We went back and forth on this forever, for hours.
I know.
For literal hours in the last book.
I know.
And this is exactly what I was talking about when we were talking about that fucking dress.
No, but the point of that dress is that she was merging the two, but not in the right way.
What do you mean not in the right way?
That original dress is subservient to the idea that she needs to do actionable things.
It's a physical manifestation of her blending of those personalities.
It simultaneously is, but she does not think of it in that way. The tailor is doing that to the dress to make it that way. It is not something that she herself is. She's not allowing herself in that moment to think. She's given an out in that moment.
She didn't realize it was a possibility. She perked up and said, you could do something like that?
I don't deny that. But I think the important thing is to say that she wasn't interested in the dress at all until it had Mistborn capabilities.
Right, because it was snubbing half of her personality.
But I guess I don't think it's so much that it's snubbing half of her personality in that moment, because she didn't care about the personality merge. She cared about being a Mistborn, not about being a full person.
We've had this argument.
It does ultimately serve. It does ultimately serve as a merger. This is important, though, because this is where that moment ties together, where she mentions it explicitly, because she even calls back to like different moments in which she calls back to the entire last book as her ignoring this. And so I think that it's really important to point out that dress is like, she wasn't thinking about the dress as a utility to go to a ball, to go do things, to show up and be pretty. She was thinking about it as a cover for her. No, that wasn't the point of the text in the moment. The point of the text in the moment is, I can cover that I am the protected Mistborn. I can cover and be pretty and still have all my weapons on me.
Isn't that just what you said?
No, the difference is she can be pretty. So here's the difference. Being pretty and being ready is one thing. In this case, she was just being ready, and being pretty was a side effect. That
wasn't the side effect.
She was directly looking at it like a side effect. That's the difference.
No, because
now she's admitting to herself. She was excited about going.
She was excited about going shopping for a dress. But she was hesitant.
No, she wasn't. She explicitly was. Oh, sorry. You're right. She was excited about going shopping for the dress.
But she was hesitant because she felt this pressure to be the Mistborn. And this allowed her to be both. And she didn't realize it was a possibility until the tailor mentioned it. But she was so excited after they mentioned it that she could be both.
You're right. In the circumstance, in that immediate sense. However, all of her actions were still defined by her being a Mistborn. It's not like she was going out and wearing a dress casually or even choosing to do so. She was forced to go dress shopping. That's a fact. She was forced to go dress shopping by Tindwyl, because she was like, you can't wear what you're wearing anywhere.
But in that conversation with Tindwyl, she admits that she's very excited to go dress shopping.
And she doesn't say it out loud. She says it in her head.
She says it to Tindwyl.
No, she doesn't say it out loud.
Okay, that doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. We know contextually that she's excited to be there. It does matter
because she's saying here that you had to learn things like I did, but please don't become someone else, Ellen. You can be both Emperor and Ellen the Man. This is the same problem, and she goes through this mental reflection of who she was in the previous book.
I feel like you're agreeing with me from the last book while simultaneously defending yourself for disagreeing with me in the last book.
No, I stand by my statement that I don't think that she'd fully accepted what she was going to be, especially in the moment in which she tears apart. Like, she has to tear apart the dress. It's unfortunate. It happens.
What do you mean? She's excited about it.
She's not excited for the dress. She's excited for the potential for the dress to also be a utility to be Mistborn. She doesn't do that to this dress.
I disagree with you entirely. I don't understand why dress. No, she doesn't do that to this dress, but I disagree that she disliked the previous dress or tore apart the previous dress.
I'm not saying that she disliked the previous dress. My point is that you can have, before, she wasn't acknowledging the two sides. She wasn't acknowledging it. No, she wasn't. She was denying the feminine side. This was the one moment in which she felt like she could express the feminine side a little bit. However, the feminine side was still subservient to the Mistborn side.
I disagree.
The ability to be a Mistborn was still priority. The ability to be a Mistborn was still priority number one.
I don't think that the necessity to have the Mistborn side makes it necessarily more important than the other one. I think they can coexist. That's what she was looking for.
Okay,
and didn't even consider the fact that they could both be.
I totally agree with the first 40% of what you said. It's when you hit the back part that I don't agree. She had not considered it, yes, but she also still, even when considering it, didn't come to that conclusion because she still was only focused on the utility. That's the entire book, is her focusing on utility. Because
the focus on the utility was the one part that was missing of the thing that she was really excited about. She needs both. She needs to blend them.
But she still doesn't, even when she gets the dress. Like, she gets the dress, which appears to blend both, but she still has to be the Mistborn first. She still has to be on edge. She's validated by the plot. Her decision is validated, but the character that you want to see Vin become is not validated in that moment. She's validated by circumstance. That's the reality. Like, because so here's the thing, PJ, if nothing happened at that meeting, she would have been prepared with all those knives for an eventuality that she thought might happen, right? And it would have been like, oh, I could have just worn a regular dress instead. Like, I didn't need to be this person. And that would have been holistically better for her character because it would have reinforced this idea. She would have been
so stressed the entire time that she'd be unprepared.
No, no. My point is that her paranoia was validated, right? Her paranoia is validated in that moment, which means that she cannot just wear a dress and be a person. She has to always be prepared to be a weapon.
But being prepared to be a weapon allows her to relax a little bit more and be a person. Whereas she would be so much more on edge being unprepared for this. For any.
Let's talk about the quote then. This entire section, right, leans on this quote, this idea, this divided personality, which is, you had things to learn like I did, but please don't become someone else, Ellen. You can be both Ellen the Emperor, and Ellen the Emperor and Ellen the Man are two very different people, just like Vin the Knife and Vin the Valette are very different people.
Yes.
You can be both, and I
don't understand why that's an argument against what I'm saying.
The argument, the validation of the assassination attempt happening means that her paranoia was founded. And because her paranoia was founded, that means that the idea of the dress being a flourish or a necessity on top of her character, like just being like a poof, she was a courtly poof, as she self-describes, just like Alrianne. It invalidates the idea that she should get to be a poof when she wants to. And so instead, she's forced to be this knife all the time. And that's a necessity of the plot. That makes sense. But it's not.
But that's exactly what she's saying here, that you can be both at the same time.
Be both. What she's also realizing, or what she's trying to encourage Ellen to be, is to not just be Ellen the Emperor, because that's all he's being right now. Just like how Vin did have a moment in the dress shop. This is where our divergence happens. In the dress shop, I think that's a great moment. I think that is exactly what should happen. The moment you go to the assassination scene is when all of the dress shop stuff is invalidated, because it's like, oh, I should have just shown up in a miscloak. There's no reason that I should have done this. This is actually inconvenient, except for it broke in a couple of places that worked. Like it's because there wasn't a positive experience with the dress before. She never does it again for the rest of the book. Why would she fly around in a dress? It doesn't make any sense. It's not
because she didn't have a position where she needed to.
That's the point. So what I'm saying is,
well, there wasn't an event where it called for it.
For the plot's sake, it works great. For the character's sake, it doesn't.
But if there's not an event to wear a dress, it doesn't make sense to wear a dress anyway.
No, it could, because you want to do it as a person. That's the difference between a character writer and a plot writer.
I entirely disagree with you.
Core.
Wholeheartedly, I am so opposed to exactly what you're saying.
This is, and what I'm trying to extract this from is a plot perspective. Vin as a character is forced to make decisions because of the plot. Vin as a person would make other choices.
Right. I get everything you're saying. I just don't get the jump that you're making that says that these two shouldn't coexist in the previous book.
They should coexist. They did not fully coexist. One superseded the other.
Yeah, I disagree with that.
They didn't.
That's what I disagree with.
And that's
because that was
the core point that I'm trying to get at. Because I agree in the dress shop. At the moment that you leave the dress shop and you go to the meeting, it becomes entirely different. That's where it shifts. Because you never see her in a dress again for the rest of the book. You never see her go into fashion. You never see her even think about it.
She needed to have
That's the point that she's trying to make here, is that you can make time to think about these things.
I don't think that's the point she's trying to make here. I don't think that's the point she's trying to make here at all. It's the opposite of the point that she's trying to make. She's saying that you should blend the two.
I'm not saying that you shouldn't blend the two. I'm saying that she realized she treated the other side like it was bad for the rest of the book. Like she couldn't even acknowledge it because she became the knife and she could only be the hero of ages. That is like,
I still disagree.
Okay.
Totally. And I think we should just move on because we've had this argument twice now and it's gone long.
Yeah, but this is the end of the argument.
It's not, because we're not any closer to agreeing with each other.
Where's the line? So many book lines. This is literally this chapter, though. This literally tackles this point.
I agree. It tackles this point.
Then what changed for Vin between then and now?
I think Vin is looking at the dress shop as a revelation of when she realized she could blend the two together, and that's her inspiration for telling Elend to blend the two.
I think Vin is looking at the mistake that was only focusing on the immediacy of things like Zane and the Well of Ascension that was pounding in her head as the error, and coming out on the other side and realizing, hey, I'm more than just I'm not a prophesied hero, and I was self-obsessed and an egotist, as opposed to thinking that I was the only one who could do this thing. And therefore I have to make a change. And so she's acknowledging that change in the moment with the dress, and she's being very self-confident. This whole book is an acknowledgement of change.
Maybe because in the last section of the book that we read, whether or not it was legitimate is still up in the air, but she refers to herself as the hero of ages. As if she still believes it. I don't know if that's true. I don't know if it was theatrics. I don't know what it was. But potentially she still believes she's the prophesized hero.
Mm-hmm. But we know the hero of ages to kind of be a lie. Like that's the whole thing
with
the last book is the hero of ages.
She doesn't necessarily know that yet. Contextually.
I think she knows that she was tricked.
But she still referred to herself as the hero of ages.
In the last book, before she realized that she was tricked.
Of this book.
Are you sure?
Maybe that was Elend.
I think they were just talking about the hero of ages.
No,
I think she was explicitly talking about...
It might have been Elend calling his wife the hero of ages.
That sounds more correct. No, Vin did say it. This was 2 weeks ago. But Ellen debunks it, and she agrees with him, being that this is the same destiny that was self-prescribed. And so she no longer... Well, it's not that she no longer thinks it, but at the very least, he attempted to debunk the idea. Sure. Yeah. I guess to put a pin a tail on the donkey... You look at the changing moment being the dress shop. I look at the changing moment for her acknowledging this being the end of the book when she realizes she's been lied to. And that's when she realizes that she's overextended herself. So those are different extension moments of the sides of Vin's personality. At the very least, we agree that there are sides of Vin's personality.
Right.
So to start, that's a good point. But beyond that, clearly we don't agree. Needless to say.
This is a very fun conversation, though. I get frustrated. You get frustrated. I know we talk in circles a little bit.
I'm not frustrated. I just think that the tough part is I have 100% context. And how does one rationalize 100% context with 65% context when you still have assumptions, that are outlying? So sometimes that can be very difficult when there are things that I want to talk about. But I feel like part of, and this again is part of that whole feeling, is my thought in this moment reading the scene is that this is almost 100% resolved. But you don't necessarily have that context. So how does one have a conversation that feels like it's important without having the it's resolved context? Does that make sense? It's a hard dance to dance.
Yeah.
Because now we're left to make assumptions. I do think, like I said, at the very least, I want to summarize because I know that I actually hold the unpopular opinion here. I think that in the dress shop, she realizes that there is a potential for these two sides to be one. In the assassination scene, that changes, and she makes that side subservient to the knife again, and she buries it again because it is not useful like being the knife is. And for the rest of the book, she goes through that experience. You don't think that. In this moment, it feels like she's acknowledging that at the very least, she went through this trial and tribulation of her personality and the way that she felt divided between these two worlds. And as such, she is trying to relay that to Ellen so that he doesn't lose himself in the necessity of action that he finds himself in, like we were talking about in the first couple of episodes, this nice necessity of the sacrifice of his ideology, kind of at the altar of ideology that we were talking about in the first couple of episodes. So she's trying to rationalize that for him so that he doesn't lose everything that he stood for to become more like the Lord Ruler than he might want to be, despite acknowledging that maybe the Lord Ruler did some things in an acceptable way. This is sort of a rubbing back and forth.
Yeah, I'm with you.
We talked about Vin. I want to make sure that we talk about Ellen. So I need something about Ellen from you here.
I just want to talk about Vin.
Well, I know. That's why I exploded here.
I mean, Ellen is on a war path towards being the Lord Ruler. And I think he needs a wake-up call to really get him to look at exactly what he and his philosophy buddies talked about, because he is so caught up with the utilitarianism and the idea that he needs to save everyone. And he's getting caught up with that to the point where he's willing to kind of make concessions, which is important to do, but he can't lose sight of the overall point. The overall goal, because it is a slippery slope to Lord Rulerdom.
Yeah, I'd agree. And that is what she's also trying to help him avoid is the slippery slope down the side of your personality that is necessitated by reality versus the idealistic side of your personality that you would love to aspire to be. And that's sort of the balancing act here, the seesawing that we see between these characters in their novels regardless of where we stand on where the seesaw sits at any particular moment, at the very least, we can acknowledge that it's about this. These entire stories are about seesawing between those two sides of you. The first book is about Vin learning to move away from being a street urchin and learning to be Valette and a Mistborn. The second book is a balancing act between, can I be a noble woman potentially, and this side of me that is overwhelmingly demanded as a knife. And then this book so far has shown that conversation with Elend between, how do I grapple with my ideology as this moralistic paladin, and how do I grapple with the realities of needing to run an empire and save as many people as possible from a very good position of being an emperor. So needless to say, the dance ends, this beautiful moment that we spent a lot of time arguing around, and they make a dramatic exit out the window, dodging out into the night and extending an invitation to anyone who might want to leave before the siege begins.
I love this sort of whoosh into the night kind of deal. Mm-hmm. Like, I still think it'd be a lot of fun to see a Mistborn just kind of suddenly take off at a very high speed without a very noticeable acceleration curve. Like,
right.
Just...
Right. It's a lot of G's, that's one of the things that I've thought about since we've had our original argument about which elementic ability would you take, is you kind of need something else to soak some of the counter forces.
Yeah.
And there's some slight cognitive explanations for the impact of allomancy on the brain, but regardless, like, your body is going to feel that 0 to 100 acceleration depending on what you push on.
Especially because, as stated, the exertion is at exactly your center of gravity.
Mm-hmm.
So it's
based
not
on what you're pushing against.
It's not distributed across your entire body. It is a point force at your center of gravity.
Yeah, that could be very nasty.
Yeah, I think it'd be really nasty.
It has a lot of potential to be really bad. Like, if you accidentally pushed yourself against a bank vault, you'd have a bad time. You'd have a really bad time. That force would snap you.
Yep.
Cool.
Yep.
With that, we go into chapter 33. We have our logbook here. Hemalurgy is of ruin. It destroys by taking abilities from one person and giving them to another in reduced amounts. Power is actually lost. In line with rune's own appointed purpose, breaking down the universe into smaller and smaller pieces, hemalurgy gives great gifts, but at high cost.
This whole thing is confusing to me because we have this scene early on in this book where a terraceman is being, like, impaled with one of the Inquisitors below them. And it seemed to me, and maybe it was intentionally improperly described.
Obfuscating,
but it seemed to me that it was just the fact that they were terracemen that they were being targeted, not that they were ferrochemists, because there was a fairly large history of terracemen that were, like, it was strictly terracemen, I think, that were used in this ritual. And says it is regarded as maybe the last ferrochemist.
So, as a note that you might pick up upon reread, focusing a lot more on that section, they're up in the Terrace Mountains. They're in that area. And we know that the Synod is dead. But are they dead, or have they been held waiting to have their powers transferred? It is a terraceman regardless. It's obfuscatious to not give the specific information of that person's class or what their abilities are, but that's because at this point the idea is, can you connect the dots without knowing? Like, you're given the beginning hints of the mystery. Now it's okay, well, why would they do that? What did they get? And now we've gotten, over the course of the logbook, connecting lines that show you, oh, okay, so they're stealing abilities. So this isn't just a terraceman, this is a ferrochemist, and they're stealing abilities from the ferrochemist.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
It does. That's fair.
Yeah. I think that's the intent, is to give you that sort of, that cognitive question of, what is going on here when you read it, to see when you're able to assemble the mystery, kind of put it together. And I think this section does a good job. So I don't feel like I spoiled anything, because it's all, at this point, it's all textual.
Yeah, that's fair.
So, yeah, because they do explicitly say that spikes are used to steal things.
They get very explicit about it during this section. In the next the next two sections, basically. Yeah, this is where we get into like the hemalurgy kind of deluge of information. So, yeah, and I think that in particular, the other thing that it defines is the sort of intent of Ruin, right? Which is that his purpose is to break down the universe into smaller and smaller pieces. It's to literally ruin things. Ruin just feels like a bad dude.
I mean, yeah.
In general.
One would argue. One could definitely argue.
So there's this idea of diminishment associated with Ruin. And it feels less, the way it's described feels less like destruction and more like diffusion. And
that's a good way of thinking about it. Yeah.
I'm curious if the reason for describing it as destruction is simply, I don't want to say alarmism, because clearly it's a bad force, but to make it more intense in our understanding of it, to draw those parallels a little bit more starkly. I don't know.
I think to a certain extent, the further you degrade something, the closer it gets to the idea of destruction. So it is, like you're saying, kind of an escalation of the idea of ruin in the long term, if that makes sense. So like ruin as a force is degradation to the point of effective annihilation, not total annihilation. I like that description. I like effective annihilation as a description. It's not about the total sundering of everything. It's just about enough that everything is broken.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, like just the eventuality of like continuing, and that's why I think the dichotomy makes a lot of sense with that of the idea of preservation and the extent to which that could extend.
Mm-hmm. I don't know.
Yeah, a lot to think about. Yep. Just dropped a little bomb there, and I'm gonna run away from it. So we move to Tensoon, and I gotta say that I love the visuals here. It feels cinematographic as we think about this dog's body, the generational dislike and hatred of the other Khandra burrowing daggers into his fur with their eyes and throwing those across the room from their various stone seats, and sort of the way this whole room is built in the Trust Warren, and the first generation's kind of lumpy shadows looking down above from their blue lit alcoves. Just the whole thing evokes a very, very clear image. I love it.
Yeah. Everything about Tensoon's, these chapters feel like interstitials. Like if you were to look at this book alone without taking into consideration the Well of Ascension, like as a standalone piece, this would feel very much like the Black Freighter.
Sure. Yeah. So to that point, think about Watchmen and the Black Freighter. This feels like I think it's a little bit less than the Black Freighter, where the Black Freighter is more of a metaphor for the plot. This is both a metaphor and the C plot simultaneously. Like this is both kind of an overarching idea of the persecution on this level, as well as being a C plot, like in a TV show. You know, it's kind of it would be, to your point, the interstitials that would be like, okay, so we're kept on the hook for this character, and we want to find out more, and we want to discover more, and we're left waiting week to week for like 2-minute snippets, kind of to like keep this person going. So I agree with you. Yeah. Holistically.
So what was the term? Cinematographic.
Yeah. Cinematographic. I'm sure is how it's actually said. Cinematographic, maybe. Who knows?
Is it a real word?
Yeah, it's definitely a real word. It's a verb tense.
Cinematography.
Yeah.
Cinematographic.
Yeah. Yeah, totally.
It sounds wrong. Doesn't sound like a real word.
I mean, the reality is it's probably pronounced slightly different. But then we move into kind of the bigger scene moment here that happens. So we have all that beautiful scene setting that happens, and he turns and addresses the first, despite Kenpar's protests over top of him that this is supposed to be a judgment. He shouts the truth of the world outside and mentions all of these different things, the earthquakes, the ash bounce, flooding, and everything else that's going on. And after a brief pause, one of the first generations asks for Kenpar to proceed. And so his judgment is pronounced by the conjurer of the second generation. And he is to be served a brutal punishment of 10 generations locked up in a bricked up pit with a hole for food slop, and then to be executed after that 10 generation run. And so he flees into the night in the dog bones, breaking many with crystal bodies who attempt to stop him and jumping his way out of the fortress unexpectedly.
A couple of things to mention. That punishment is very brutal, but you missed the brutal part of it. He is to be beaten until broken. I can't remember the exact term used. Until shattered?
Yeah, that was kind of defined last week, which is the only reason that I kind of skipped it. It was just more explicit this week.
Yeah, I mean, but then set to live out the 10 generations in the pit. So he is set to be in excruciating pain for 10 generations. Are they on the 10th generation of Khandra yet?
That's a great question.
I think they're on the 9th.
Yeah, I think you're about right.
So if they're on the 9th right now, and it's been
1,000
800 years, 1,000 years.
Yeah.
That's
ish. Yeah.
He's in for a millennia of torture before starvation.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's a great point, is that that there are so many different generations. I'm trying to find a firm number here. Okay, so there were 11 generations according to the text so far. The 11ths were being taught.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
So it's been
a reference inside of the book. Yeah.
And I guess here's the question. What is the length of a generation? Is it until a generation dies? Is that the lifespan of a generation?
No, well, it doesn't feel like that because the first hasn't died. You know what I mean?
Like, that's what I'm saying.
So none of them have died. So it feels more like a class in like a high school sense. You know what I mean? Like it's a birthing generation, not a dying generation.
Yeah.
So you got to look at it from the front end as opposed to the back end. But yeah, to your point, it's a giant question mark, flagrant question mark.
It would have to be that way because it couldn't progress until he dies.
Right. The oldest member of the generation would be holding back everyone from being born if it were based on death. Yeah. Cool. That makes sense. Anything else on 10 soon? Anything else we missed? I liked adding in the description of the pit and the eternity of damnation effectively.
Oh, I guess what this section does is maybe not entirely, but it almost shoots my theory in the dick.
Which one?
The idea that there are no more first generations and that it's all a puppet show by the seconds. It's still possible that they had some plant to pose as a first generation to call down, but it seems more likely that the firsts are actually aligned with the seconds at this point.
Yeah. It does seem more like the seconds have been assigned to take the duties of the first. Like the sort of mundaneities, I should say, almost of what the first generation have to go through or have to be responsible for. Yeah.
Yep.
In their age.
Exactly.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. Okay, cool. With that, we go into part 3, The Broken Skies. We start with chapter 34 here. Logbook. Ferrochemy, it should be noted, is the power of balance. Of the 3 powers, only it was known to men before the conflict between preservation and ruin came to a head. In ferrochemy, power is stored up, then later drawn upon. There is no loss of energy, just a changing of the time and rate of its use.
So this is regarded as a balance, but I don't know if I buy that entirely. It feels self-sufficient in the idea of a cycle of energy.
Mm-hmm.
But if we've got three sources of power and there are three types of magic, why wouldn't we have three sources of power? And if there is a well for ruin, and if I'm right in thinking that there's a well for preservation, is there a third force tied directly to Feruchemy, as opposed to the attribution that it's the balance between the two? I think that is likely, not likely, but a possibility.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, I think that makes sense to me. It does raise questions of, is there a third source of power, or what is this third source of power? How does it draw upon? Could it be more of one force than another, or could it just be one force and hasn't been declared yet? It does ask. There's a giant question mark left right there inside of this logbook. The other ones have been answering, and this one feels more like it was trying to answer and trying to point out that there could be a balance, but yeah,
pretending to answer.
Yeah, I mean, are you saying that I was pretending to answer?
No,
it kind of. Okay.
It was pretending to answer.
Fair point. So from that logbook entry, we move into Marsh to start the third part of this novel. This third part of the novel, of course, is called The Broken Skies. So this scene with him walking up the steps and killing everyone in his way with those ritual triangles from the Lord Ruler has the biggest, what if the worst version of Magneto was alive and did not give a shit about anybody that I've ever read anywhere else. Like, this is murderous sociopath, given it's not Marsh doing it, it's Ruin, but through Marsh, Ruin is acting. It's just wild. And there's just this sort of aura of calm, cool collectedness that is just like a lot to really take in from this brief chapter.
Mm-hmm. So you mentioned that it's Ruin acting, not Marsh. And I don't know if it's better or worse because of this. Like, depending on how you look at it, you could make the argument either way that it is Ruin, but Marsh is intentionally giving up control, but is still aware of everything that's happening. We know contextually that he doesn't feel the weight of things like he would if he was completely conscious and like out of Ruin's control. But at the same time, he's still aware of it. So, like, does that make this worse, or does that make it more forgivable?
I think it makes it palatable. I don't think that it makes it more forgivable. I think it makes it something that can be stomached, not something that is acceptable.
Okay.
Which is on your spectrum. And just that's where I stand on that spectrum. It still lets it contains bad connotation, but it at the very least makes me give a brief pause, especially because at the very end of the chapter, Marsh actively reflects on this idea that how much of a relief it would be to actually just kill these people right now, as opposed to making them suffer what is eventually going to happen to them. And I think that's a twisted mercy that I think comes from Ruin inhabiting his perspective, but still nonetheless feels like a mercy given what he knows Ruin to be capable of.
Yeah. It's intentional. Like, he has an end game. He has a plan.
Yeah.
I don't know if he'll have the opportunity to enact it. I'm still worried that him giving up control to Ruin so often and for so long will diminish his ability to push back against it later. But that's a problem for tomorrow, Marsh.
It's a great way of putting it. It's definitely a problem for eventually Marsh. Yeah. Oh, man. And as he continues to make his way through this mansion, he arrives upstairs and runs a spike through the man's heart, the owner of this mansion, stealing his almatic ability as a smoker. We also start to get some of the rules of hemalurgy, that there's this sort of freshness to the kill when it's executed with the spike. What do you make of this sort of whole moment of him going and collecting this ability and this sort of rule on the spike itself.
I thought he didn't kill the guy. I thought
He
explicitly he
put
left
it through his heart.
But I thought it was mentioned that he left it for Ruin because Ruin wanted to save that for himself.
No, so Ruin ran the spike through the guy.
What does it say like at the end of this section? Because I totally swear it said that Marsh didn't kill him because he was saving it for Ruin.
What you're conflating is the idea that what I was just talking about, which is that they didn't kill the people in the mansion that were around because they left many of them alive. Yeah.
Okay.
No, he is explicit. This guy is explicitly dead.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
Had that mixed up in my head.
No worries. I mean, it's a small section, but it's quite a bit of kind of context.
Dense shit.
Yeah. You were not wrong. Here's the text line. Ready? So the man knelt confused as Marsh left. He didn't kill them. The part of him wished to. Unfortunately, Ruin wanted to claim that privilege for himself, which is when he's walking away from the town. So it does kind of sound as though something is about to happen and Ruin is about to kill them, but it's a delay of action, delay of game. Briefly, Marsh was tempted to wait until the man sobered up so that killing him could be performed properly, but Ruin would have none of that. Marsh sighed at the injustice of it and then slammed the unconscious man down against the floor and drove a small bronze spike through his heart. It wasn't as large or as thick as an Inquisitor spike, but it killed just as well. Marsh ripped it out of the man's heart, leaving the former nobleman dead, blood pooling on the floor.
Yep, there we go.
Yeah, he did. Dead AF.
He dead, yo.
Okay, but thinking about that dead man and the freshness, sort of the capabilities of this system. Mm-hmm. And we know we were given the example of it stealing, obviously, ferrochemical abilities. Now we've seen it steal an elementic capability. What do you think?
I'm still trying to figure out how this, like, there has to be a balance in some way. There has to be a cycle and like a recycling of this energy, because it's mentioned that energy is created and energy is destroyed and energy is in balance. But I think truly that there's going to be a way that this all works together as one machine. And there's going to be a cycle. And like, how is this energy recycled from Ruin into preservation, from hemalurgy into allomancy? Like, there has to be a way for that to work, and maybe ferrochemy is somehow the process by which that can happen, but I still don't quite understand it and feel like there's a piece missing.
Okay. All right.
That's what I'm thinking about.
I think that's a reasonable thing to think about, because it's still, as mentioned, I feel like we get a lot of things about hemalurgy, and you're thinking more about the cycle of hemalurgy, allomancy, and ferrochemy than you are about hemalurgy itself, if that makes sense. You're trying to work out that you've now moved on from the small magic system into how did these trio of magic systems fit together. And I'm kind of wondering your thoughts about the small magic system, if that makes sense.
Hemalurgy itself.
Yes.
So, God, it all feeds together though, because it requires me to understand how
it fed together the whole time. It fed together the whole time.
It did. But how am I going to talk about the hemalurgical magic system and how it relates to this section without me trying to figure out how allomancy works within the body and blood of an allomancer and how that can be stolen?
Fair enough.
I think this isn't really telling me anything about hemalurgy. It's telling me about the process by which allomantic abilities are siphoned into a spike. And that process is stabbing, but there's clearly something that happens when stabbing happens.
We do get more on this throughout the logbooks. We'll get there. With that, we'll move into chapter 35. Again, these are pretty short chapters here at the end, so kind of going through them as we will. Logbook here. Hemalurgy is a power about which I wish I knew far less. To ruin, power must have an inordinately high cost. Using it must be attractive, yet must sow chaos and destruction in its very implementation. In concept, it is a very simple art, a parasitic one. Without other people to steal from, hemalurgy would be useless.
Yeah.
There's a rule.
They're stealing the abilities from a body by stabbing someone with a spike of a specific type of metal. It's the nuggy blood.
It's the nuggy blood. It's that sweet, sweet nuggy blood. Okay. So moving into this chapter, of course, we go back to Spook chatting with Breeze before quickly departing when we'll call it the Phantom for your sake, but the Phantom Kelsier fires a parting shot that he never really liked Breeze to begin with.
Yeah. What a dick. He did say early on, contextually, that they were all chosen for a reason. He didn't say that they were all chosen because he liked them.
True.
So there's that to keep in mind. But this would also be a very effective, subtle way of sowing distrust between Spook and the other members of the crew, giving him reason to not share information with Breeze, to distance himself from it while still being faithful to Kelsier and Kelsier's crew and the spirit of Kelsier. It gives him a legitimate reason to not trust Breeze.
That's fair. Yeah. That makes sense to me.
If there's some nefarious plot that this Phantom is trying to play out.
It begins to sow some seeds of doubt for sure. There's definitely there are definitely questions raised here that we can ask ourselves in these moments. So I totally feel that. With that, I do want to move into kind of I think that a lot of Spook's chapter moves very smoothly as we kind of have these questions of the Phantom, right, and of Kelsier. And that is sort of kind of fired back at him in a couple of different moments in which he even suggests that it might be easier to kill Quellion. But Spook is in and of himself on a very different warpath, which is that of chasing down the lead of the person of whom exposed him for who he is. And that path is to find Dern for a conversation. What'd you make of Dern's use of the story of Spook's death to manipulate the population into action against Quellion?
This feels like a much larger scale chess game than I was originally giving it credit for. When it comes to Dern. But given that, and looking at it from that lens, it understanding that Dern knew who Spook was makes a lot more sense and tracks well. I think something we should continue to keep in mind, or I will continue to keep in mind, is that this Kelsier character is constantly feeding Spook information. And just getting these interjections from Spook and these conversations, like what conversations are not affected by this Phantom is always going to be in my head. Yeah,
that's a fair point. I do want to bring up here at the very least, talking about some like scene setting that happens here. The fact that a Tin Eye shows up in town, he has unlimited money, seemingly points to him directly being connected to the Empire and whatnot, just goes to show how poorly Spook is actually covering his tracks as an Allomancer. And that is a fascinating tangent on him being kind of ineffective as a spy in this moment. Like he's, instead of being as quiet as he thinks he is, even in his approach as this sort of tin savant, he is more out there than I think he ever wanted to be or intended to be.
Yeah, he's not that subtle.
Yeah, he's a kid. Like that's what I'm trying to give him credit for. Is like he's he's a teenager.
Right. Exactly. Thinks he's sneaky. Not that sneaky.
He's not sneaky. Yeah. Definitely wanted to bring that up. To get back to what we were talking about with Kelsier, right? And sort of the Kelsier that's there. Spook has this conversation with Kelsier about Quellion and just killing him outright, what to do next. There's kind of some back and forth that goes on there. Did you have any particular thoughts? I mean, touch on anything you want to, of course. I think you've done a good job of laying out a lot of your foundation here as you approach it, but...
I mean, it's still sort of that idea that this could be the same entity that was Zane's god.
Mm-hmm.
Especially with the calls for violence and the calls for murder. It's not the same sort of like outburst situation, but at the same time, maybe that's intentional and maybe that's feeding into the individual personality of whoever they're inhabiting or interacting with. I could totally believe that Zane was this person prone to impulsive decisions. So making sudden impulsive like shouts about like, hey, you should do this right fucking now is very different than Spook, who is a lot more calm and maybe more calculated in his decision making. So a rational conversation about why he should murder the citizen is maybe more effective and more of a strategic way of manipulating Spook.
That's an interesting way to look at it, kind of comparing old Kelsier versus how you'd see new Kelsier making moves.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. To end this chapter, Spook is approached by a stranger in the night to save his sister from Quellion, trading labor for his sort of pseudo superheroism. It's very much like kind of seeking out a vigilante to do good work. Did you have any thoughts here?
So I believe this stranger was one of Quellion's like guards or something. Like it's mentioned that he recognizes him, right? It's not like a just sudden person off the street. Okay, cool. Good to know. Otherwise I was going to be like, oh no.
No, you're right.
But I kind of like that Spook is just off the bat understanding that his powers can be used as a bargaining chip as opposed to just jumping into like vigilantism or philanthropic. Yeah, superheroism works well. Yeah, that's a great descriptor.
He is instead doing a better job of bartering as opposed to just being outright good.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, that's what you said. I was just reiterating it. I'm not. Yeah. I didn't add anything there.
But that was a good.
Yep. Just making sure. A summation of sorts. With that, we go into chapter 36. This is a long one here, folks, so stay in here with me. In hemalurgy, the type of metal used in a spike is important, as is the positioning of that spike on the body. For instance, steel spikes take physical elementic powers, the ability to burn pewter, tin, steel, or iron, and bestow them upon the person receiving the spike. Which of these four is granted, however, depends on where the spike is placed. Spikes made from a certain other metal steal ferrochemical abilities. For example, all of the original Inquisitors were given a pewter spike, which, after first being pounded through the body of a ferrochemist, gave the Inquisitor the ability to store up healing power, though they couldn't do so as quickly as a real ferrochemist, as per the law of hemalurgic decay. This obviously is where the Inquisitor got their infamous abilities to recover from wounds quickly, and was also why they need to rest so much.
It's good information.
This is so much information.
It's a lot of information.
There's a lot of rules. I think that you now have potentially enough information to throw everything together, if that makes sense. Outside of maybe some very obtuse things like, well, this is how the blood cells of a person who has allomantic blood has, and this is how, you know what I mean? Like there's some things that remain too microbiological to really dig into. And that's not the intent. Does that make sense?
It does. It feels much in the same realm of why an allomancer can't affect metals inside of inside of a person's body.
Oh yeah, I mean there are reasons.
I'm sure,
perhaps.
Yeah, and I know Marsh mentions that he can like see the iron content of someone's blood. So like that.
Yeah,
throws that under the bus.
There are things that transcend the rules as you understand them, and that's intentional. So,
yep.
But this, I think, does a good job of, at the very least, beginning to give us a lot of foundation. This week entirely gives us a lot of foundation for where hemalurgy is and where it's going and our understanding of it. So I want to talk about Set and Ellen's conversation kind of at large. And this conversation is a large chunk of the chapter. It goes hard. It's back and forth. You can kind of feel the weight of Set's anger at Ellen's actions and sort of the way that Ellen defends himself in these moments, kind of talking through the decision to go through and meet Yeoman, the decision to go through with the siege, and it really kind of in a very well of Ascension way defend what already happened. What do you make of this conversation between these two very different deposed kings?
It felt good. This conversation felt good through and through, not in the same way that Ellen's conversation with Yeoman felt good, but for similar reasons, that they're both making good points. Ellen and Yeoman are interacting on this like chess level, whereas Set and Ellen are interacting on this like just
they're playing like Risk, trying to play together to make a move. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like that's
a good way to put it.
It's like they're playing Axis and Allies is maybe a better example that people might not understand, but where like you have to work together as a team, without being able to fully talk about it.
But they're going to butt heads. And they're both going to have very valid reasons for why their decision is right. And they're going to be completely like opposed to what the other person is suggesting, but they're both right.
Right.
You know? So
totally.
I don't know. I like that we got both sort of arguments in this section because they just feel different, but both feel good for different reasons. I'm not sure. I know there's a better way to articulate that, but I don't know it off the top of my head right now.
Yeah, I do largely agree with you. I think that the analogy of chess versus trying to take like two chess players playing against each other versus two players debating a chess move makes a ton of sense because they're both sitting there kind of butting heads, not competing against each other, but instead trying to elaborate upon their position on the board and why they think they should take a different position. Yeah. Trying to justify the next move. So makes sense to me. You know, and I really enjoy this conversation. It goes on for quite a long time, but then we go up to Demu and kind of the way that he's interacting with the soldiers of whom have gone through the mist sort of sacrifice and whatnot, and how those stricken could potentially have been punished for a lack of faith, for a lack of faith. And he kind of attributes this to the Church of the Survivor and sort of the teachings there. And he also brings this up again later. We kind of like wax and wane between this and two different points in the chapter with a little bit of kind of Ham interceding here. But Demu eventually comes to the point that he believes that he isn't worthy of his position as leader of this army as the general. And this, again, to Demu feels kind of reinforced by the precision of the numbers, by the precision of the people of whom have been decimated by this plague, by the mists rather, not the plague, but the number of months that Kelsier was in the pits reinforced this perspective. There feels like a lot of justifications and rationalization without verification.
Yeah.
There's a bunch of shins for you.
Yeah. It's amusing, but ultimately it's really frustrating how these connections and these like coincidences are made and used to prove the truth of the statements, you know? Like it's a runaway religious fruitcakeism. Like it's the birth of a cult.
Runaway chain reaction. Right.
Yeah. It's the birth of a cult or religion in this sense. It's just getting stronger and stronger through not real valid arguments. But
well, and what feels crazy to me is that it's the Church of the Survivor, right? And like Demu survived in theory. So it feels like it should maybe be considered the opposite, that you're like put through this task, you know, and the fact that he survived should be reinforcing his faith, not, you know what I mean? Like it's just an odd thing where it feels like it's almost a mismatch Why would it be a punishment? If you're taking it from the faith lens, you know what I mean? Like it's just weird. It's a weird note.
Yes.
But I love how hard in this chapter Ellen is working to not be the bad guy as well, to not kill everyone inside of the city, to figure out a way to win this as quickly as possible without ever really being the aggressor. All of that entire internal dialogue, I think, is really yummy and appreciated from him. I can't think of a better way to say it, because it's like, I just wanted this sooner. I want all of this rationalization at the beginning of the book, and we get it here when it feels, pertinent and explanatory in a good way. But yeah, I did this is that yummy justification that I was kind of begging for. And I continue to use the term yummy because it is satiating while not especially nutritious. This is my expectation, not my deliverance. This is not my, this is not satisfaction necessarily. But
yeah, it just feels like more progression towards Elend and his time as emperor becoming more and more aligned with the trajectory of the Lord Ruler, and what he potentially went through at the beginning of his reign, and how he eventually came to terms with the idea of this is how it has to be, as a justification for the sort of actions or inactions that he takes or doesn't take.
Yeah. And this does have that sort of analytical sense, especially when you think about the Lord Ruler really in the early days, where he was sort of absorbing those cultures and kind of choosing the cultures that he wanted to keep and not keep. This does have that same semblance, but on a smaller scale. I think you scale it down for Elend because it does feel more personal. And I think that Elend's threat, while very supernatural in nature and very larger than life, is one that it's so interesting to think about this dichotomy between the two, because the Lord Ruler was preparing for this eventuality, and Elend, when faced with this eventuality, is actually dealing with smaller problems than what the Lord Ruler prepared for. Right now, the immediacy of the moment is a little bit smaller.
Yes, but I think it's important to remember that Elend is in his 4th year as emperor, and the Lord Ruler, like the earliest sort of span of time.
4 years emperor.
Oh, yeah, you're right. Not even.
No,
it's been 4 years since the Lord Ruler died. The earliest time span, other than like the immediacy of the Lord Ruler and his time with the power of preservation, the earliest time span that they talk about is like the first couple centuries of what he does. Like, we don't know if this is exactly what the Lord Ruler went through in the first year or two or decade.
And I don't mean to use that as like a demeaning thing. All that I'm saying is, like, to your exact point, the threat of ruin for the Lord Ruler was 1,000-year threat. For Elend, it's a present threat, but the reality is that he still has to deal with a very small level of like bullshit to get people to deal with, like, and that's what he has to square away the year one problems of the Lord Ruler at the same time as squaring away the 1,000-year problem of the Lord Ruler. Like, he has to deal with the first year and the last year of the the Lord Ruler at the same time. Yeah, that's true. And that's what I think is so crazy, because it makes it feel very dichotomous.
Unfair.
Very unfair. It is for sure unfair. It puts our boy Elend in a really tough spot where he doesn't want to be philosophically. So, yeah. To that point, they're having a conversation bouncing back and forth between Demu and Elend, and talking about a lot of different things and sort of the way that they should be fearful of the myths and thinking about the camp and extreme faith. And Elend is about ready to ask Demu a question about faith, and then shouting begins in Elend's bivouacked army.
You just love the term bivouac, don't you?
Dude, it's not used frequently enough.
It's true.
It doesn't need to be, but it is used in this chapter. And I was like, fuck yeah. Saying it again. Yep.
Do they mention what's going on here, or is it just screaming and that's the end of the section?
Just shouting. That's the end of the section.
Okay, good. Then my guess doesn't doesn't have to be beholden to anything. But I feel like anytime we've seen shouting within an army, and I think it's happened a couple times, it's always been Kolos approaching, I think. Do you know of a different time that it wasn't? I feel like that's all times
in this novel. No, I think you're right inside of this book.
I'm guessing the Kolos are coming to town.
The Kolos are coming to town. The Kolos are coming to town. That means Inquisitors.
Probably.
Well. Ho ho.
Ho ho.
Ho ho. But this does leave us on a good cliffhanger, because this is, like we were saying, like a lot of character development. This is a tie over between sections. So we kind of get like the end of one bit, then we get the beginning of the next. So there are questions there. We end the week, of course, as always, talking about the next logbook. And the logbook here says, hemalurgic decay was less obvious in Inquisitors that had been created from Mistborn. Since they already had allomantic powers, the addition of other abilities made them awesomely strong. In most cases, however, Inquisitors were created from mistings. It appears that Seekers, like Marsh, were the favored recruits. For when a Mistborn wasn't available, an Inquisitor with enhanced bronze abilities was a powerful tool for searching out Ska mistings.
Right. So I guess my biggest question is, do you have to be allomantic in order to accept hemalurgical powers? Or could you be
great question.
A ferrocymist? Or could you be entirely mundane? And I don't know if we get any of those answers.
That's not answered yet, for sure. But it just saying like that is a question at this point, for sure.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Is there a requirement of status? This is more of a clarification of why Inquisitors were chosen the way they were chosen.
And that makes total sense. I really appreciate that this logbook addresses that.
Yeah. Yeah. I totally agree with you. I think that it's a great logbook for that very reason.
Mm-hmm.
Cool. Any other thoughts on this section, on this week?
I don't believe so.
Mein Freund. Okay. Cool. With that, we go into next week. Next week, we are going to be reading chapter 37 through 43. Again, that's chapter 37 through 43 of The Hero of Ages. So that's where we'll leave you for this week.
Thank you, as ever, to Tim and Andrew for helping us keep our show's lights on. You can check out the links in our show notes. You can find our schedule, Patreon, previous episodes, websites, all of our social media accounts, all in one very convenient location.
Yeah, don't forget, we're an Atomic Pylon production. We've got a lot of other shows going on at the moment. You can feel free to check out Words and Whiskey Short Pours, as well as Tales of Kana and Howler Pod if you want to check out the back catalog of episodes. We've got a lot more coming out over the course of this next month, so stay tuned as we launch the full bevy of shows. Beyond that, as PJ mentioned, you can interact with us on our socials at Words Whiskey Pod on Twitter, Instagram, and Reddit, as well as you can email us any questions or thoughts or anything else that you might have at wordsandwhiskeyshow@gmail.com. You can, of course, join our Patreon, support us at patreon.com/wordsandwhiskey, and you can get our t-shirts on TeePublic. Just follow the link inside the show notes, as PJ mentioned. We've got a lot of merch there. We recently had someone go through and buy a bunch of sweatshirts. We recently sold a onesie, of which looks incredible, and I literally shed an almost tear staring at it. It was adorable in the best ways. I love it.
It was great.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you, everybody, so much for your support. It really does mean the world to us. And we will see you next week.
Yes, we will. All right. See you next week.